and I'm a senior automation engineer for Integral Ad Science. I'm going to talk a little bit about me and us and how I relate to Jenkins in this conference. Integral Ad Science is a global metrics and analytics company that helps connect impressions between brands and customers. So if something like that interests you, like your marketing department or whatever, there's a link to our website. You can check that out. As far as more about me, I have been contributing to the Jenkins project for about 6 years now. Doing different things here and there. I maintain the GitHub OAuth plugin. There's other plugins that I have formerly maintained. I also open and close bug reports, edit the wiki. So there's a lot of different areas that people can find they can contribute, and those are just some of the ways that I enjoy contributing. You can also find my GitHub user. So this talk is about the Script Console and Jenkins, but you'll find a lot of automation and scripts in my GitHub profile that I think you would find useful. And I'd also like to point out, any demos that you see today, those are going to be under my GitHub profile. So you can also, when later this video is going to be recorded and published, you can actually visit the links and try the demo out as you're viewing it, because it should be repeatable. So a little bit of what you can expect during this presentation. I'm going to introduce you to the Jenkins community infrastructure. It's a little different than other talks in that regard, because in order to really take full advantage of the Script Console and be able to fully and repeatably automate Jenkins, it makes sense to make use of that community infrastructure that is out there. I'm also going to be talking about what is the Script Console, because it's not always well described. I'll give you some quick tips on Groovy. So if you're a Java developer, it's basically going to be the too long didn't read version of what Groovy is if you already know Java. Then I'm going to do a demo. That demo is going to include security implications. You're going to see a live exploit, and there's going to be a lot of other things that you'll probably start sweating in your seats depending on how big your Jenkins instance is. But then I'm also going to share some tips on how you can operationalize your Jenkins, whether you're a Fortune 25 or a smaller shop like 500 employees. It doesn't matter really the size as far as taking account for good practices and operationalizing your Jenkins instance. And then I'm going to do a demo on the Script Console and how it relates to Jenkins configuration. And then I'm going to follow up with links for more learning, helping you to study and better grow at using it. And I'm going to say a quick phrase, as far as that will be relevant. I'm going to say it now so that you can recall it later. But essentially, the Jenkins runtime is itself the configuration. And by modifying the runtime, you're modifying the configuration that's in memory. And when you run a jenkins.instance.save, you're serializing the runtime to disk as XML. So when you see me modifying stuff in the runtime in the Script Console, nearly everything has an instance.save method in which you could serialize that configuration to disk. And that makes it really powerful for idempotent configuration that's detecting configuration has changed and only changing if it has, or even just doing things in the Jenkins runtime you would never thought possible. So a couple things to keep in mind that I'm going to reveal about sort of my mindset so that you can try to take on some of that mindset is to, anytime I get into an interactive programming environment, the first thing I think of is how do I list classes on a method, how do I list methods on a class? Whether there's an instance or just a raw class, how do I interactively discover what's there so that I could poke and prod it? So I went ahead and put up, and this is from a web search. You can list methods on a class in Groovy. So you can web search that later, and you'll find this is probably the first result. And then also, how to determine what class something is, because the reason why these two things specifically are useful is because as you're interacting with the Script Console and the environment in which you're working, it will reveal to you class names in which you can web search, and that will take you straight to the source code in the Jenkins project, in which you can learn more about the constructors and stuff to modify it. other things that I had in mind when I went about this journey for myself is how do I configure something reliably? That is, let's say you take your scripts, and you can even think about your own scripts. Let's say you take your scripts, you bootstrap it 1 year, 2 years from now, from right this second. Are they still going to work? So I think of these kinds of things when I'm doing all this. How do I guarantee? Oh, I already mentioned that. And also, how can you start effectively writing your own scripts? So I really hope that I arm you with the knowledge and the ability to grow so that you could take what you learned from here and you're able to grow and write your own scripts that apply to the Jenkins instances in which you might maintain. So first is more my spiel on the Jenkins community infrastructure. So there's an artifactory which hosts the war and plugin versions. So that means anytime there's a published version of Jenkins.war and anytime there's a published version of any plugin, you can find it at the Maven at the Artifactory repository, which is up here on screen. Also, that's of interest is the Jenkins Update Center lists the Maven group artifact and version coordinates. So you can, and that's found in your advanced config settings of your Update Center. So you don't even necessarily have to remember this URL. It's in your Jenkins already. You can look at it. It's just a JSON blob, but the neat thing is it lists the Gav parameters, so you can programmatically generate a Gradle file that will pull in those dependencies for you as you're building stuff. I'd also like to point out that the Jenkins core source code is hosted on GitHub at github.com/JenkinsCI/Jenkins. I would also like to point out that the source code for all of the plugins in which you interact and maybe use is also typically hosted under Jenkins CI. Not always, but it usually is. There's over 1,000 repositories there. So it's definitely a good place to look when you're trying to find the source code for a plugin. Typically, web searches will take you to this as well. I'd also like to mention that the demos that I'm going to be running today, they're all under my GitHub profile. This one specifically, the demo Jenkins World 2017, it involves building an RPM, pinning the exact version of Jenkins, the exact versions of every plugin I plan to use in my demo, and building it in a holistic, monolithic RPM in which it can be installed somewhere. It also includes some Script Console scripts that I tend to set up myself. I'd also like to make a shout out to Jenkins CI/Docker. There is a Docker image of the Jenkins master, which also allows you to pin the exact version of Jenkins master, but also mention the exact version of every plugin in which you want that master to have. So if you're looking at having immutable infrastructure and rolling out Jenkins in a safe manner so that you can very quickly iterate or spin up test environments of your Jenkins instances, you can make use of either the Docker or maybe some of the methods that I use myself to ensure that when you bootstrap your Jenkins, it is safe, reliable, and you can also spin up test instances pretty easily. So now a little bit on what is the Script Console. The Script Console is a groovy interpreter in the runtime, but I will say it is the most powerful, the most dangerous, and also the most awesome interface Jenkins possibly offers. If you're using pipelines, the global pipeline configurations are running in the same environment as a Script Console. So when I'm running exploits today, keep that in mind. That's why you should review your global pipelines. Also, when you uncheck the sandbox and you approve someone's script, they are also effectively running in the Script Console in that same environment, the Jenkins runtime. And keep in mind, it is the runtime, so it can easily decrypt credentials. It could easily touch agents that are connected to Jenkins. It could decrypt credentials, go to the agent, and then go to the things that Jenkins could touch from that agent. So there's really, there's no limit in what you can do as far as Jenkins is concerned inside of the Script Console. So that's why I'm having this talk, to encourage you to be more educated about it, because this is not typically knowledge that is quite common, but the people who know it are typically the dangerous ones. And by sharing this information, hopefully I am helping you be safer and understand better about this advanced component of Jenkins that is less than a half dozen people understand this. So I'm hoping we spread the knowledge about this, basically. So real quick, before I get into the nitty-gritty, I'd like to explain to you a bit about groovy from a Java perspective. Parentheses on methods are optional. The same goes for semicolons at the end of the line if you're writing Java code. So that means if you have a getter, like the fourth bullet point down there, if you have a getter, like get my method, you can take off the parentheses. You can also get my method can be translated to lowercase my method there. And a lot of DSLs are built this way. It's similar to Ruby in that regard. Setters and getters are automatically generated for private methods and properties. If they don't already exist, they will be generated. And also private methods, private final variables can be modified via Java's reflection API. So there really is no part of the class or instance in which you can touch that can't be modified, even if you're using best practices for Java development. Groovy is just really powerful, and Java is equally as powerful. And also, I'd like to point out that the last executed statement is the return value from that method or script that's being run. So let's move on. So now I'm going to do a live demo where I'm going to show you some security implications. And if you've ever been told to disable CSRF protection, this exploit that I'm about to show you is cross-site request forgery. Notice up in the URL bar, I just have a simple file. But this could be anything. You could be visiting a web page that submits a post request. It could be anything that executes a payload. So it could be a Word document. Oh, sure, I can make it bigger. You'll see the script eventually anyway, so tell you what, I'll just submit the cross-site request forgery and increase the size here. So what I did here in that script, I did a cross-site request, a CSRF request, and all I'm doing is I'm printing, and then I'm reading etc password from my VM. So here you can see I'm using Vagrant, so there's a Vagrant user in here. But the fun doesn't stop there. I'd like to also, I can also read credentials.xml. So here, jenkins.instance.root is the root of my Jenkins home from the runtime, and I just so happen to know where credentials.xml is because it's always in the same place. So I went ahead and read that. And you might think to yourself, okay, well, I read the credentials.xml, but the passphrase is encrypted, like it normally is. But also keep in mind, this is the Jenkins runtime. And somehow Jenkins has to be able to decrypt these credentials in order to interact with your agents, in order to deploy things. So let's go ahead and take this credential that I've highlighted and decrypt it using the Jenkins runtime. So here, that encrypted password was decrypted to I'm a little teapot. That was the value of the credential that you saw, that encrypted string. And that's offloaded to the class hudson.util.secret. That was created as a secure means to store things safely on disk when the runtime would serialize to XML. But anyone can actually do this and learn this. I learned this on my own. No one taught me this by simply reading the source of the credentials plugin. So it's not hard to view the source of these kinds of things and just learn how to do it. I'm presenting this to show you that. And also executing arbitrary commands. It's not even limited to arbitrary shell execution. So when you see security vulnerabilities that say arbitrary command execution, it's talking about stuff like this. Everything that you're seeing that I'm doing, whether it's decrypting credentials, downloading payloads, installing backdoors, or even something as simple as here, listing my Jenkins home, doing a long listing where you could see the permissions. There's secret.key and secrets, so I could easily just download all of it, and I can be able to decrypt your credentials later if I really wanted to. So this is really just to show you the scary side of Jenkins. It's not to deter you from using Jenkins. Through education, I hope that you will be able to better understand and secure Jenkins. And part of that is also disabling CSRF protection. So I am going to enable prevent cross-site requests for forgery exploits. I'm going to save this setting. And I'm going to go back to my little CSRF demo, and I'm going to submit this query again. And this time it was blocked. It said, no valid crumb was included. That's not to say you're not completely protected, because if someone has local execution of your machine, there's a lot of things that they can do. But this prevents a whole class of attacks, in which I've just demonstrated is one of them. So now that I told you how scary Jenkins can be, let's talk about how you can secure it. Operationalizing Jenkins, as I like to call it. First off, enable CSRF protection, and don't disable it. It protects you from a wide class of attacks. The next is use TLS to secure Jenkins. That is, if your URL has HTTPS in front of it, then it's secure with TLS. Otherwise, someone will be able to sniff possibly admin credentials off the wire, and once they have admin credentials, you can see quite easily they can get very deep very quickly. And the other thing is to make sure that you have authentication and authorization enabled. I've seen places that don't have that, and that's never good. I tend to personally also disable Jenkins CLI. Now, keep in mind, the whole class of attacks, there were 0 days that had come out this year for past couple years for Jenkins CLI. A lot of those have been patched, but me personally, if I don't use it, I tend to just disable it. So there are scripts out there in the wild, including in my GitHub repository, in which disable Jenkins CLI, and any other services in which you're not using. So if you're not using SSH inside of Jenkins, disable it. It's more of just limiting your attack surface to make sure that there's fewer things that can be poked in which to discover and get into your Jenkins instance. I personally also tend to not allow create job permissions. That doesn't mean no one can create jobs. That just means I limit how they go about doing it. And I'll do a demo later to show you more about that. And I also tend to like to personally bootstrap Jenkins by pinning war and plugin to specific versions. And you can refer to the Jenkins infrastructure slide later. There's also a lot of examples out there in the wild if you look for it. So my next demo will be how the script console and the runtime relates to its configuration. So if you recall back at the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned that Jenkins runtime is itself the configuration. And by modifying the runtime, you're modifying the configuration that eventually gets serialized to disk. So let's see an example of that. So this is the script console. You tend to get to it under the Manage Jenkins interface. It's at the top level. And the first example that you see in here is the Jenkins.instance plugin manager plugins, which is pretty neat. It just lists the methods. Whoop, I forgot to refresh my page since I turned on CSRF protection. It just lists the methods, or it just lists all the plugins that you have installed. But I tend to be the curious type, so that's what I mentioned, is don't be afraid to be curious. So let's take off a little bit and then run it. That returned an instance of something. Take off a little bit again. And what you're left with, one level up, I'm not going to bother because that's actually just a class. It's not an instance. What this actually is this is the instance of the Jenkins runtime itself. So this web UI that we're looking at, we're actually looking at the instance of what's displayed here. Down below, you see the result. The last executed statement is the return value. And that shows you the class name that's being used, an @ symbol, and also a hex number. That's typically just what's called a class instance. It's just it's an instantiated class that is an object in memory. And this is how you get it. And then, being the curious type that I am, I went ahead and said, what methods are available to me on this class? So I So I ran that, and one thing I'd like to point out, we're not going to go through all of it, but there's a get security realm. There's also an authorization realm. There's many settings here that you might recognize if you've configured Jenkins. And when I go about automating something in Jenkins, whether it's a global setting or what have you, I tend to first poke and prod to see what happens. So I'm going to configure a new security realm. It doesn't matter what values I put in here because this isn't real. I've disabled the security on this, which you don't want to do in your normal setup, but I don't care. This is the demo. So I'm going to save this. And I'm going to go ahead and call get security realm. And what you see is returned here is a class and an instance of that class. So what I did then is I would Google for it. Okay, let me look up this class. And what I came to was GitHub. This is actually the GitHub OAuth plugin. What you see here is a constructor here around line 128. I can zoom in a little bit so that you can see it. And you'll notice here that there are settings in which you might recognize from the plugin, such as you've got your GitHub Web URI, your API URI, client ID, client secret, OAuth scopes. And if you're looking at the configuration dialog, here you have GitHub Web URI, API, client ID, secret, scopes. So a lot of times when you're browsing the source and viewing the web UI, you can relate to what's in the source code. The Jenkins community does a good job to relating the source code to what's displayed in the UI. So you can tend to find the relationship and sort of just read and figure it out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and instantiate a new instance of the GitHub security realm, and then I'm going to set it to my own settings and then use set security realm. So here I have my GitHub security realm. I put in my own settings that don't matter, hello, goodbye, foo bar, don't care. And then I went ahead and saved it, and it just so happens that set security realm on Jenkins.instance serializes things to disk when you call it, but not everything does. So if you're in here and you're changing stuff and you find that it doesn't persist across reboot, it's probably because you forgot to call an instance.save. So there's a Jenkins.instance.save method too, and which could be called, but I didn't bother this time showing it. Here I'm going to read the global config XML in the Jenkins settings, and here you see the GitHub security realm configured, and this is another way I tend to also discover classes that have been configured in Jenkins configuration when I'm trying to figure out how to change stuff. If you look at the top of my highlighted selection here, you see that there's that class there for the GitHub security realm. You also see the settings persisted, my don't care and hello, goodbye, and foo bar. And then if I were to refresh the web UI, because I did it through the script console and updated the runtime live, you notice that the settings here have changed. So now that I've sort of given you a couple of tools and things in which you can grow to learn, really what you want to know is, what can I do with it? How do I make it apply to the instance that I have, or what can it really do? Let's show some of that off. I'd like to point out here that I tend to configure a lot of settings, as I'm sure many of you do. One of the things I have installed here is the Yet Another Docker plugin. It's a beta plugin, and it tends to have over 100 configuration options associated with it. I'm going to disable my Wi-Fi. I know what's wrong. That's CSRF Chrome. Try again. So I'm going to add the configuration here, and then I'm going to add a template. And one thing I'd like to point out is this plugin has just settings upon settings upon settings, experimental options, and it just keeps going. And I've been at places where I've had to configure more than 20 of these in one Jenkins instance. Can you imagine having to configure more than 100 settings for just a single plugin? And Jenkins has over 1,000 plugins in which you would configure it depending on where you're at. So one of the things that I created for myself was a bootstrap method to really show off how to go about doing this. Here's a dependencies.gradle in my Jenkins Bootstrap Jervis project. And one thing I would like to point out to you is what I'm doing in here, and this was auto-generated, I didn't manually do it, it was based on the Gav parameters in the update center, is I'm pinning the exact version of the war, and I'm also pinning the exact version of all the plugins. And then I built it into an RPM, and then installed that RPM and started Jenkins. And what you're left with when you start Jenkins is something you all may have seen before if you started Jenkins for the first time. It's that introductory hello dialogue. However, I don't personally need to go through this introductory dialogue. I already know what I want. So I'm going to bootstrap this instance live and configure all of the settings live. And what it's doing here is it's using Vagrant under the hood. So it pulled the credentials from the Vagrant VM and set up the username and password. Then it interacted with the CSRF API and pulled down a crumb. And from there, I was able to configure additional settings like skipping the Jenkins wizard. I created a job, created a couple views. I set a primary view. I deleted the default all view. Configured some credentials for the Docker agent and credentials for other things, and up some other miscellaneous settings, and including configuring the Docker cloud, which I had mentioned before. And then at the end, it gave me the username and password used for the VM. A little side note, if you have a username that is not admin, it will not by default show you the password. But so I'm going to go ahead and log in. And here's a Jenkins instance that has been fully configured from the ground up. You have two views here. You have a welcome view, a GitHub organizations view, which the GitHub organizations view doesn't have any projects or anything like that, but you have a welcome view and a small document that tells you how to get started. This Jervis project that I've kind of mentioned a couple times, it's two words smashed together, Jenkins and Travis. Essentially, I like doing things like ingesting YAML from Travis CI and generating Jenkins jobs from it. So that's what this project's about. I'd also like to point out that in the configuration page, I'm going to open that in a new tab. The configuration page has all the settings from Docker in which I wanted to set up for my runtime. And there's a lot of things in here that, that I personally like to configure, like caching with volumes and things like that. So that bit that you just saw was the script console bit. These settings here, and they're idempotent. So if I were to run this again, it would actually detect, hey, these settings are already here, so I'm not going to change anything. So you can actually see you're able to get idempotency by querying the runtime and saying, hey, I'm trying to set settings to something, but let me tell me what you already have. And if nothing has changed, there's no need for you to change the settings. So that's where idempotency comes in with these scripts. So I'm done demoing the script console portion of it. So I mentioned before that I don't like people having create job permissions. So that's kind of where this comes in, where I can generate jobs from YAML. The first example is the Jervis library itself, which is a library for the job DSL plugin. It's meant to be imported in job DSL scripts. And the job DSL plugin just essentially allows you to describe jobs via code rather than the web UI. I'm a very big fan of describing things as code. And the job DSL plugin allows you to do that. One of the things that I did with it is I have it query the GitHub API, and I I like the idea of users storing their metadata about their build and about their deployment process right in with their project. And Travis CI always spoke to me about that. And keep in mind, this project predates the Jenkins file and pipelines. So there might be a little bit of conflict in ideas here, but essentially it was the same community desire where the community wanted to have a way to describe their build and deploys in code. And here you can see it iterated across my branches, and for 2 branches it matched and generated jobs for it. Here is a screenshot of the YAML file in which it generated jobs from. So I'm saying my project's groovy, get some dependencies, run a couple Gradle commands, and only do it for certain branches. And then at the bottom, you'll see that I have it doing things like collecting artifacts, JUnit tests, and code coverage reports, that sort of stuff, things that a developer would want to do. And keep in mind, the idea here is I don't necessarily want a developer to have to be an expert at Jenkins. They just know what they want. They know that they want certain tools in their tool chain, certain versions of Java. They don't need to know all the different toggles and bits in Jenkins. That's why I became an expert at it, so they didn't have to be. So that's a lot of where this idea came from with this YAML specification and essentially offloading the advanced stuff to something that generates it. So let's go take a look at the folder here. We have an organization folder. For me, it's just my GitHub user, because that project was in my GitHub account. And I'm going to just build the most simple branch that I have. The other one's a matrix. And essentially what's going to happen here is it puts a build in the queue and just hangs out. The yet another Docker plugin gets notified, and so it goes, oh, there's a build in the queue. And there's labels matching the configuration that I have for an agent template. So what it then does is it goes ahead and provisions an agent on the fly inside of a Docker container and treats it like a typical build agent that you would have static. The only difference is here it builds, runs its build, has a proper init and everything that you would expect in a container that has a lot of tools in it. And when it finishes its build, it goes ahead and deletes the container. We don't necessarily have to watch this finish. I only showed you and described how it works. But if you were to go look at this presentation later and you're watching this video and you bootstrap this stuff, you certainly can, let it finish and watch how it works. So here up on the screen, feel free to take a picture. I have links which I hope will help you grow. These are just things that I found useful, and also some additional community resources. First, probably the most obvious is learning Groovy, because Groovy is a very pivotal language, and you can reuse it in other places in Jenkins. Learning Groovy applies to doing pipeline work, and because there's so many parts to Jenkins which use Groovy, it's just useful to know it in general. And then there's a Jenkins community scripts repository, Jenkins-scripts, which the community has built a large number of script console scripts in which they're already using to do their stuff. So I told a little fib earlier when it was like a half dozen. There's actually a lot more people who play with the script console than me. But hopefully, with this presentation, there's going to be a lot more. Yeah, so these are the resources. You saw me do the GitHub OAuth plugin. Since I'm the maintainer of that, I also have examples in the wiki page for how to configure it. And then also configuring Jenkins as code, the master settings, not just the job settings, is actually a wanted thing by the community, by other developers, by other admins. That's tracked by issue Jenkins 31094. So if this topic interests you, go ahead, check out that issue, subscribe to it. If you have cool solutions, kind of like the one I just demonstrated, where it configured it idempotently, post your comments and feedback in that issue. I also have a personal project, Sandscape, which is like in super alpha. It's not really usable, but it's sort of my personal solution or proof of concept for that issue number. And then once again, there's my GitHub profile, Sam Rocketman. And if you see me around the conference, feel free to say hi. I'm very friendly. And I enjoy talking with people. So if there's questions that you have for me as far as your own Jenkins setups, I'd be happy to put my head together and tackle some of your hardest problems. And I'll also be at the Jenkins expert booth after this presentation. So if there's any questions, you're welcome to ask me, but that is basically the content of which I wanted to share. Thanks. Does anyone have any questions that you'd like to ask? We still have 10 minutes. Okay, I'll start with you. Go ahead. The question was, what's the difference between the Script Console and the Scriptler plugin? So the Scriptler plugin is configured to run Script Console scripts. Essentially, that repository that I mentioned, the Jenkins-scripts, that's actually a repository for the Scriptler plugin, and it allows you to have a drop-down list of pre-made Script Console scripts, but there's no guarantee whether or not they would work because Jenkins moves so fast, and there's so many scripts that a lot of times they're not updated quick enough, which is why I tend to have my own. Which is why I tend to pin my versions and my plugins when I'm writing my own scripts. Go ahead, up front. I'll just go left to right, or right to left. Okay. So to summarize what he was talking about, he mentioned that I don't typically allow people the ability to configure jobs, and how do I go about protecting the runtime of jobs from maybe malicious developers who might cat or steal the credentials that are in that runtime and ship them off somewhere. So how do I relay the responsibility of creating jobs to a developer but still be protected? Is that a good summary? So that YAML solution that I just showed you, that's probably about the best thing I've come up with so far. The nice thing about that is anyone typically has the ability to click that generate button. And what I would also recommend, which is not configured in those scripts, is also setting up authorization per organization. So you can set up authorization per organization and also delegate the ability to configure credentials to people in that organization. And so you can then have each organization have their own set of managed credentials in all of the Jenkins folders. And they typically don't, they can be fully self-service and manage their own credentials. I've done it and seen it. There's a lot of plugins. The credentials plugin, I would say make use of the credentials plugin and its APIs. So when you're working in the script console or the job DSL scripts, that you can the job DSL scripts, you can have them run like they're in the script console, so you can query the APIs of the credentials plugin. So I would recommend just reusing some of the APIs that are already there. Yes? Say one more time. Okay, so the question was, if I create my own plugin, how do I figure out the steps to configure my plugin via Groovy in the script console? Right? Have you? Cool. So the first thing I would recommend is having proper equals methods. So when you have the instance of your settings, you want it to return whether or not it's equal based on the settings of that instance, right? So a lot of times, something that's often overlooked is the equals method. But by having an equals method, it makes it really easy to compare and change settings idempotently. Another thing, which I didn't really discuss, but one of an oft used, or I should say I often use, method is get extension list. So when you're looking in the config XML for your plugin, you might see a descriptor impl class for it. And essentially, what you need to do then is you need to do a jenkins.instance.getExtensionList. So jenkins.instance.getExtensionList. And then I tend to also put it in a string, but you essentially copy the contents of the configuration that's in XML that has a descriptor impl, and if it's got an underscore hyphen, that's the text form of a $sign. So when you're putting it in text format, you do your plugin path, the class, $descriptor impl. You can pull your settings right out of the runtime from the Jenkins instance that way. There's also tons of examples of people doing that in Script Console scripts. So, and if you forget or you want a more specific example, you can always hit me up and ask me later through my contact channels. Any other questions? I've got 4 minutes left. I'm sorry, say again? You don't have to pin the plugin versions, but like I meant, the question was, do you have to pin your plugin versions? The answer is no. But I personally like to pin plugin versions the way that I do, because one of the advantages to doing that is I can spin up many test instances. So let's say you have an instance in production and you're afraid to change it. You can then spin up a test instance and just install the thing that production's using with the exact version of the master, the exact version of all the plugins, and you could even copy your production configuration in and change some values in it, and it will effectively be a similar thing. It will never be the same, but it will be very similar because it'll have all the same runtime components in it. So that's why I recommend pinning all that stuff. Does that make sense? Any other questions? We got 3 minutes. Yes. Can you say that again? I'm sorry. Okay, so the question was, what are the disadvantages to updating settings via the script console versus changing XML files? So one disadvantage that I know of is there's a really high barrier to entry. You can imagine that all this tech and programming that I'm talking about, it can be really difficult to learn and grok and understand up front. So I'd say that's an extremely huge disadvantage over, say, templating your XML with config management or what have you. However, one huge advantage that I've personally found is I can update my settings live on a Jenkins instance without having to restart it or reload configuration from disk. So that's one of the advantages that configuring via the script console gives you when you're using configuration management. Does that help? Is there any other questions? Well, I think that's it. So if you want to chat with me about your own setups or whatever, when I'm done here and get a little settled, I'm going to be over at the Jenkins Experts booth. Or if you just see me down the hall, don't be shy. Feel free to say hello, and I'll say hello back. Thank you.